November 15, 1942. Inside a dimly lit office at the Government Code and Cipher School in Bletchley Park, England, Margaret Thornton sat by a frosted window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as young naval officers rushed past her desk, carrying urgent dispatches. They believed she was just another clerical worker, too old and too slow to contribute anything meaningful to the war effort, spending her shifts on handicrafts while younger minds did the real work. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew was that this quiet woman with her endless scarves and mittens would develop a breakthrough that would help track and defeat 3 German submarines in the North Atlantic, changing the course of the convoy war forever. Margaret had arrived at Bletchley Park 8 months earlier, recruited not for her mathematical brilliance from Cambridge, though she possessed that in abundance, but for her background in textile patterns and her photographic memory for sequential arrangements. At 43 years old, she was among the oldest women in her section, surrounded by graduates barely into their 20s who processed intercepted messages with the efficiency of assembly line workers. The recruitment officer, Commander Edward Hastings, had seen something in her application that others missed. She had written her doctoral thesis on repeating patterns in medieval tapestries, demonstrating how weavers embedded information into seemingly random decorative elements. Hastings recognized that the same mind that could decode visual patterns in cloth might excel at finding patterns in encrypted German naval communications. But Margaret's arrival had not been welcomed by everyone. Lieutenant James Morrison, a Royal Navy officer assigned to liaise between the codebreakers and the Admiralty, made his skepticism clear from the first day. He was 29, a decorated officer who had survived the sinking of his destroyer in the Denmark Strait, and he had little patience for what he viewed as civilian eccentricities interfering with military operations. When he first saw Margaret at her desk, knitting needles in hand during a break, he turned to his colleague with barely concealed contempt. "Do we really have time for this?" Lieutenant Harrison asked Morrison quietly, nodding toward Margaret's knitting. "Half our Atlantic convoys are being devastated, and we are paying someone to make tea cozies." Morrison grunted in agreement. "The statistics are devastating. Last month alone, we lost 96 merchant ships, over 500,000 tons of supplies at the bottom of the Atlantic. Every day we do not crack their naval codes costs British lives. Yet here sits someone treating this like a knitting circle." What Morrison did not know was that Margaret's knitting was not a distraction from her work. It was her work. In her previous life as an academic, she had developed a peculiar method of thinking through complex problems. While other mathematicians used paper and pencil, Margaret found that her mind worked best when her hands were occupied with repetitive mechanical tasks. The rhythm of knitting freed her conscious mind to wrestle with abstract patterns, while her subconscious processed information in ways that pure analytical thought could not achieve. She had tried to explain this to Commander Hastings, who, to his credit, understood immediately and gave her permission to continue, despite the raised eyebrows it generated. The breakthrough came on a freezing January morning in 1943. Margaret had been assigned to analyze a series of encrypted messages intercepted from German submarines operating in Grid Square BD-14, approximately 600 nautical miles west of Ireland. The German Naval Code, which the British had designated Triton, had been partially broken months earlier, but the submarines had recently begun using an additional layer of encryption for their most sensitive communications regarding convoy attack plans. Traditional decryption methods were failing because the Germans had introduced a randomization element that appeared to have no discernible pattern. For 3 weeks, Margaret had been staring at these messages during the day and knitting during her evening shifts, which she had volunteered for when the section became overwhelmed with intercepts. She had filled 7 notebooks with frequency analyses, letter distributions, and hypothetical key sequences. Nothing worked. The randomization seemed truly random, which should have been impossible given the mechanical nature of the German encryption machines. Then on that January morning, while working on a particularly complex cable-knit pattern for a sweater, something clicked in Margaret's mind. She was creating a pattern that appeared random to the casual observer, but was actually based on a mathematical sequence the Fibonacci series, hidden within the arrangement of knit and purl stitches. If she could hide a pattern within apparent randomness, could the German operators be doing the same? She set down her knitting and pulled out the intercepted messages again, this time looking not at the encrypted text itself, but at the metadata, the transmission times, frequencies, and call signs. What she discovered made her hands tremble with excitement. The randomization was not in the message content at all. It was embedded in the transmission schedule. The German operators were using the time intervals between messages, measured in minutes, as an additional encryption key. A message sent 14 minutes after the previous one used a different starting position on their encryption machine than one sent 9 minutes later. Margaret spent the next 48 hours barely sleeping, testing her hypothesis against months of archived intercepts. Commander Hastings, alerted to her activity by the night shift supervisor, came to her desk at 3 in the morning to find her surrounded by papers, her knitting abandoned for once, her eyes red but blazing with intensity. "I have it," she said simply. "The temporal pattern. They are using time itself as part of the encryption key. If we chart the transmission intervals and cross-reference them with the astronomical tables for their operational area, we can predict the initialization vectors for their machines." Hastings studied her work in silence for 20 minutes, occasionally asking a clarifying question. Finally, he nodded. "This is extraordinary. If you are correct, we could read their attack coordination messages in near real time. How confident are you?" 85%, Margaret replied. "Maybe 90. I need access to the naval intelligence files on submarine positions to test it properly. If I can correlate known attack times with the decrypted messages using my method, it will prove the system." Within 6 hours, Margaret had her confirmation. Using her temporal key system, she successfully decrypted a message from 3 weeks earlier that revealed the planned attack coordinates for a convoy that had indeed been attacked at precisely those coordinates 2 days after the message was sent. The decryption was perfect, every word clear and unambiguous. Hastings immediately called an emergency meeting with the naval liaison officers. Lieutenant Morrison arrived at the briefing room, expecting another frustrating discussion about incremental progress and probable solutions. Instead, he found Commander Hastings and Margaret Thornton presenting what appeared to be complete, unencrypted German submarine communications. Morrison listened in stunned silence as Margaret explained her methodology, occasionally referring to her knitting to illustrate how pattern recognition worked across different mediums. "You are telling me," Morrison said slowly, "that while we have been treating this as a purely mechanical decryption problem, you solved it by thinking about it like a knitting pattern." "Not exactly like a knitting pattern," Margaret corrected gently, "but the principle is similar. Pattern recognition across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Germans were clever. They added a temporal dimension to their encryption that conventional analysis would never catch, because we were only looking at the spatial arrangement of the coded letters." Morrison felt his face flush with embarrassment as he remembered his dismissive comments about Margaret's knitting. "Can you apply this to current intercepts, active operations?" Margaret nodded. "We have been logging transmission times for every intercept. I can begin processing today's messages immediately. If there is an active submarine preparing to attack, we should be able to identify the target convoy within hours of intercepting their coordination messages." The first test of Margaret's system came just 5 days later. On January 23rd, radio operators at the interception station in Scarborough picked up a series of encrypted transmissions from a submarine the British had designated U-719. Using Margaret's temporal key system, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park decrypted the message within 3 hours. It revealed that U-719 was moving to intercept convoy HX-224, currently 300 miles south of Iceland, and planned to attack at dawn on January 25th. The Admiralty immediately diverted 2 destroyers and a corvette to reinforce the convoy's escort. They also rerouted the convoy 30 miles north of its planned course. When U-719 arrived at the expected intercept point, it found empty ocean. After surfacing briefly to confirm its position, the submarine was detected by aircraft from the escort carrier HMS Biter. The submarine was forced to dive and evade, eventually abandoning the attack entirely after depth charges from the destroyers damaged its dive planes. The submarine survived, but its mission failed completely. Not a single merchant ship was lost. The convoy reached Liverpool with all 37 vessels intact, carrying 15,000 tons of aviation fuel, 8,000 tons of steel, and 300 military vehicles. The successful defense was attributed in official reports to exceptional vigilance by the escort vessels, with no mention of decrypted intelligence. Margaret Thornton's name appeared nowhere in the documentation, but inside Bletchley Park, everything changed. Lieutenant Morrison personally visited Margaret's desk the day after the convoy arrived safely. She was knitting again, working on a complex pattern that seemed to be a map of some kind rendered in colored wool. "Miss Thornton," Morrison began, then paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology, a significant one. I dismissed your methods as eccentric and your presence as a waste of resources. I was completely wrong." Margaret looked up from her knitting, her expression neutral but not unkind. "You were not alone in that assessment, Lieutenant. I am quite used to being underestimated. It can actually be rather useful in certain contexts." Morrison managed a rueful smile. "I suppose it can. For what it is worth, I have recommended to the Admiralty that your system be implemented across all submarine tracking operations. They have agreed. Effective immediately, every German submarine transmission will be processed using your temporal key methodology. Over the following months, Margaret trained a team of 12 analysts in her system. The method proved so effective that by March 1943, the British were reading approximately 70% of German submarine operational traffic within 6 hours of interception. The impact on the Atlantic convoy battles was immediate and dramatic. Submarines found themselves consistently outmaneuvered, their planned ambush positions mysteriously known to the escorts, their coordination messages somehow anticipated. Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Steinhoff commanded U-476, and by April 1943 he was deeply troubled. His submarine had been on patrol for 6 weeks, and every time he maneuvered to intercept a convoy based on headquarters intelligence, the target inexplicably changed course just before his arrival. It had happened 4 times in a row. His crew was exhausted, supplies were running low, and they had not achieved a single successful attack. "The convoy coordination messages must be compromised," Steinhoff told his first officer, Oberleutnant Werner Kohler, during a whispered conversation in the commander's tiny cabin. "There is no other explanation. Either the British have broken our codes or there is a spy at headquarters who is transmitting our positions." Kohler shook his head. "Impossible, Herr Kalu. The encryption machines are unbreakable. The engineers assured us. The mathematical permutations number in the billions. Then explain to me how the British know where we will be before we arrive," Steinhoff countered. 4 consecutive evasions cannot be coincidence. Someone is reading our mail." Neither officer realized how correct Steinhoff's instinct was. At that very moment, Margaret Thornton was sitting at her desk at Bletchley Park, knitting needles clicking steadily, analyzing the intercepts from U-476 and 17 other submarines. She had identified a pattern in Steinhoff's transmissions that suggested he was one of the more cautious commanders, someone who reported his positions more frequently than regulations required. This actually made him easier to track, as more transmissions provided more data points for Margaret's temporal analysis. On April 14th, Margaret decrypted a message from U-476 indicating the submarine would be refueling from a supply vessel designated Nordmark at coordinates 47 degrees north, 23 degrees west on April 18th. The Admiralty dispatched the destroyer HMS Hesperus to the location. When the destroyer arrived, it found both the submarine and the supply vessel on the surface, connected by fuel lines, completely vulnerable. The German lookouts spotted the British warship at a distance of 8,000 meters. Chaos erupted on both vessels as they desperately attempted to disconnect the refueling equipment and dive. The supply vessel Nordmark, unable to submerge, attempted to flee at its maximum speed of 12 knots. U-476 managed to disconnect and begin a crash dive, but not quickly enough. The destroyer's sonar operators maintained contact throughout the dive. What happened next was a textbook anti-submarine operation. HMS Hesperus made 5 depth charge runs over the next 2 hours, dropping a total of 48 charges in a pattern that progressively tightened around the submarine's position. Inside U-476, the crew endured a nightmare of explosions, each detonation sending shockwaves through the pressure hull, shattering light bulbs and causing leaks in the diving plane's hydraulic system. After the third run, Kapitän-Leutnant Steinhoff made the agonizing decision to surface and abandon ship, rather than watch his men perish in the depths. The submarine broke surface 200 meters from the destroyer, its deck hatches flying open as the crew scrambled out, many of them bleeding from ruptured eardrums, all of them knowing their vessel was finished. The engineering crew opened the sea valves and U-476 slipped beneath the waves for the last time, while the destroyer picked up the survivors. 41 men, including Steinhoff and Kohler, were pulled from the cold Atlantic water. 7 men had perished during the depth charge attacks. As Steinhoff sat wrapped in a British naval blanket aboard HMS Hesperus, shivering and defeated, he kept repeating the same question to the British sailors. "How did you know? How did you know we would be there?" No one answered him. The official report stated that the destroyer had been conducting a routine patrol and had encountered the submarine by chance. Kapitän-Leutnant Steinhoff would spend the rest of the conflict in a prisoner-of-war camp in Canada, never learning that a woman with knitting needles had tracked his every movement across the Atlantic. The defeat of U-476 was the second submarine that could be directly attributed to Margaret's temporal key system. The third came in May 1943, during the climactic battles that would later be recognized as the turning point in the Atlantic conflict. U-658, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Hans-Jürgen Rademacher, was part of a large coordinated attack group targeting convoy ONS-5, a slow convoy of 43 merchant ships heading from Britain to North America. The convoy was massively important, carrying not cargo, but sailing in ballast to pick up vital supplies from America and Canada. Margaret's team intercepted and decrypted the coordination messages for the entire attack group. The intelligence revealed not just the submarine's positions, but their planned tactics, their fuel status, and their assessment of the convoy's defenses. The Admiralty used this information to reinforce the escort with additional destroyers and to position long-range aircraft to provide air cover at critical moments. The battle lasted 5 days and became one of the most intense convoy actions of the entire conflict. Multiple submarines attempted to penetrate the escort screen, and several succeeded in reaching attack positions. However, the escorts, guided by the decrypted intelligence, were able to counterattack with unprecedented effectiveness. 13 submarines were either defeated or forced to withdraw with damage. Only 13 merchant ships were lost from the convoy, a ratio that shocked German naval headquarters. U-658 was one of the submarines that did not survive. On the night of May 5th, following repeated attacks by escorts guided by Margaret's intelligence, the submarine was forced to surface with critical damage to its electric motors and steering gear. Unable to dive or maneuver effectively, and with aircraft from HMS Biter approaching at dawn, Korvettenkapitän Rademacher made the decision to scuttle his vessel. The crew abandoned ship and was taken prisoner by the destroyer HMS Vidette. U-658 sank in water 3,000 meters deep, taking with it all secrets of how the British had consistently outmaneuvered the attack group. The defeat of these 3 submarines, U-719 forced to abandon its attack, U-476 sent to the bottom, and U-658 scuttled by its own crew, represented far more than 3 tactical victories. They were part of a larger pattern that spring. In May 1943 alone, 41 German submarines were defeated or severely damaged in the Atlantic, while convoy losses dropped to the lowest levels in 2 years. German Naval Command, unable to explain the sudden reversal in fortunes, temporarily withdrew submarines from the North Atlantic entirely in late May, effectively conceding defeat in the convoy battles. The intelligence provided by Margaret's temporal key system was not the only factor in this dramatic shift. Improved radar, additional escort vessels, long-range aircraft, and better tactics all played crucial roles. But historians who gained access to the classified records after the conflict consistently identified the breaking of the German naval codes, and specifically the innovations introduced by analysts like Margaret Thornton, as critical multipliers that made every other advantage more effective. Yet Margaret herself remained almost completely unknown. At Bletchley Park, she was respected and appreciated by those who understood her contribution. But the culture of secrecy that governed the entire operation meant that even her family did not know the true nature of her work. Her elderly mother, living in Cambridge, believed Margaret was doing clerical work for the Foreign Office. Her sister, serving as a nurse in London, thought Margaret processed paperwork for military pensions. Neither had any idea that Margaret's knitting pattern notebooks, which she sometimes brought home on leave, contained some of the most closely guarded secrets of the conflict. Lieutenant Morrison, transformed by his experience from skeptic to advocate, wrote several commendations for Margaret that were filed in classified archives. In one dated July 1943, he wrote, "Miss Thornton's contribution to the anti-submarine campaign cannot be overstated. Her innovative methodology has directly enabled the successful defense of numerous convoys and has contributed to the neutralization of multiple hostile submarines. Her work represents the highest standard of analytical excellence and demonstrates that brilliance can emerge from the most unexpected sources and methods. I deeply regret my initial failure to recognize her value, and I consider it a privilege to have witnessed her achievement." The temporal key system continued to be used throughout the remainder of the conflict, so though it became less effective after mid-1944 as the German submarine fleet diminished and changed its operational patterns. By the time the conflict ended in Europe in May 1945, Margaret had trained over 60 analysts in her methodology and had personally processed more than 4,000 intercepted messages. The precise number of convoys saved or submarines defeated as a direct result of her work is impossible to calculate, but conservative estimates from post-conflict analysis suggest her system contributed intelligence that protected at least 15 convoys and played a role in the defeat or deterrence of over 30 submarines. After the conflict ended, Margaret returned to academic life, taking a position at Oxford, where she continued her research into pattern recognition and cryptographic systems. She published several papers on mathematical patterns in textiles that were actually disguised discussions of cryptographic principles, though only those with the proper security clearances understood the deeper meaning. She never publicly discussed her work at Bletchley Park, maintaining the secrecy oath she had taken, even when historians began investigating the code-breaking operations in later decades. When she passed away in 1989 at the age of 90, her obituary in the Times of London described her as a distinguished mathematician and textile historian who had served in an unspecified government position during the conflict. The line mentioning her government service was the only hint of her real wartime contribution. Her knitting needles, worn smooth by decades of use, were donated to the Bletchley Park Museum along with her papers, though the connection between the humble wooden tools and the defeat of German submarines remained unclear to most visitors. In the museum today, Margaret's needles sit in a small display case alongside a photograph showing her at her desk, a half-finished scarf visible in her lap. The accompanying plaque reads, "Margaret Thornton, Cryptanalyst, 1942 to 1945. Developed the temporal key analysis system for naval intelligence. The understated description does not mention submarines, does not mention convoys, does not mention the lives saved or the tactical victories enabled. But for those who understand the history of the Atlantic campaign, the simple needles tell a profound story. They represent the principle that brilliance manifests in countless forms, that innovation often comes from unexpected directions, and that the quiet, underestimated individuals working in obscurity can change the course of history. They remind us that during humanity's darkest hours, victory came not just from ships and aircraft and industrial production, but from the analytical genius of people like Margaret Thornton, whose knitting needles proved mightier than torpedoes and whose pattern recognition skills helped turn the tide of the longest campaign of the entire conflict. The officers who once mocked her slow knitting never knew that each click of those needles corresponded with another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Another convoy saved, another submarine outmaneuvered. They saw an elderly woman engaged in a domestic craft, unable to imagine that her mind was simultaneously tracking temporal encryption patterns across multiple dimensions of data. Their blindness to her true capability was perhaps the greatest security measure of all. While they dismissed her as irrelevant, she was quietly helping to win the conflict. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.